Good morning. Thank you, Derek, Dave, and Val, and our wonderful esteemed guests here this morning. And a special shout out to the students from all of our wonderful Utah universities that are attending on a wonderful discount from the World Trade Center. So we do appreciate that, Derek, as well. As a business professor myself, an economic developer, and advocate for international expansion, I see the success that Utah businesses experience when they do go global. And what might be most surprising to some of you about our international reach in Utah is that it's happening around the state. I live in Moab, and there are companies that are very successful exporters, companies like the Synergy Company and GlowGerm that have international customers in 40, 50 countries around the world. They're shipping their goods around the globe daily from Moab. Staley West in Cedar City is another one. Loveless Ash in Price is another very successful exporter. Campbell Scientific in Logan are just a few more examples of companies off the Wasatch Front who are succeeding internationally. In Utah, we do understand that there are more barriers to entry for businesses in rural areas. Believe me, I know that. Logistics get a little more complicated in distribution, but as with any challenge, Utahns are determined to find an effective solution, and that's what Utahns are so good at. The resources for businesses are many. I've never seen anything like this in any other state or country in which I've lived. And we are constantly finding innovative ways for all Utahns, all Utah companies to compete globally, obviously based on those statistics that Derek gave us. So I would like to thank, even personally, the World Trade Center of Utah, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, the U.S. Commercial Service, and many other international business advocates here in Utah for the great work that they are doing around the state. And because of their work, our businesses are connecting around the globe, and they are bringing jobs and revenue and growth to the Wasatch Front and to the rural communities alike. These businesses are more aware of opportunities outside of their communities now, and they are connecting in meaningful ways with others half a world away. So it's very exciting. And speaking of connecting with others around the globe, it's time for us to hear from someone who does know a thing or two about global networks. It's my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce to you today's keynote speaker, Edward Luce. Edward Luce is the chief U.S. commentator for the Financial Times, with a weekly column that keeps him pretty busy and regular editorials on the U.S. economy and politics. Mr. Luce is internationally recognized for his work. And prior to his current position, Luce was the Financial Times Washington bureau chief, so got his feet wet in D.C. politics. He managed a team of 10 D.C.-based reporters, and he led the paper's coverage of U.S. politics and the economy. He has also worked as the Financial Times South Asia bureau chief. He's certainly covered the globe. A Geneva-based correspondent for the Guardian newspaper, Financial Times correspondent for the Philippines, and Financial Times capital markets editor in London. Edward Luce has experience working in the political sphere as well. You know that if he was in D.C. He actually served as a speechwriter to Larry Summers, the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration from 1999 to 2001. He's also an acclaimed author. You might be familiar with some of his books. If not, go out and get familiar with them. I certainly will in my international management class. India, in Spite of the Gods, The Strange Rise of Modern India. Doesn't that sound fascinating? And Time to Start Thinking, America and the Specter of Dissent. Doesn't that sound fascinating? I know I'm not the only one interested to hear Mr. Edward Luce's perspective on how current affairs can affect Utah businesses, so I won't keep you any longer. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Edward Luce.
Hi, Lily. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cynthia. I'm very glad that you mentioned in that generous introduction, that detailed introduction, that I was speechwriter for Larry Summers when he was Treasury Secretary, and not when he was at Harvard, because he didn't have a speechwriter at Harvard. So I think that probably came across. I'm always delighted to come to Utah. I was here last year, in fact, staying in the gorgeous Sundance to speak at Brigham Young with some of the most intelligent students I've come across. I'm also particularly, on a personal level, delighted because my aunt, my London-based aunt, Emma Nicholson, who runs this very impressive non-governmental organization called the Ammar Foundation, which builds health clinics in war zones, so in Iraq, Syria till recently, Lebanon. She comes to Salt Lake City every year. She's got a lot of friends in the Mormon community and beyond. And whenever I tell her I'm coming here, she introduces me to 10, 15 close friends of hers, some of whom are here. But also because in the context of which we're meeting, which is 2 weeks before the most extraordinary presidential election I think any of us have seen in our lifetimes. In that context, what my Aunt Emma has always told me about Mormons is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, namely the importance of character, the importance of decency, the importance of integrity, and how important that used to be, and may still be again, I hope, as a core tenet of conservative philosophy. My father was a member of Parliament in Britain for the Conservative Party for 30 years. And so I grew up in the age of Reagan and Thatcher, when these prized sort of leadership qualities of conviction, courage, leading by example, and integrity were still very much in evidence. And I don't think I need to belabor the point that in this election they've been notable for their absence. And also that a number of prominent politicians, particularly in the Mormon community, such as Jason Chaffetz recently, Jeff Flake, Mitt Romney, of course, and even, for goodness sake, Glenn Beck, have rejected the Republican nominee, not on grounds of ideology, but on grounds of character. And I think that's a very, very important point to make. And so when I was asked to do this talk several months back, I thought, 2 weeks before the presidential election, it might be a bit odd to go to a state like Utah where it's just not going to be in play. Well, of course, it is now in play. And I think the fact that Utah is in play bespeaks of what an extraordinary election cycle this is. So let me talk to you a little bit about how you govern, or how you can govern in an age of populism. What that means for businesses, what that means for America's standing in the world, what that means for a renewal of American authority in the world. How much more difficult is it? Well, as Cynthia says, I come from Britain, and as I'm sure you can hear, but I've been based in DC for the last 10 years, and on June the 24th this year, my own country took a decision that most people didn't believe it was capable of taking, a decision that very much hit against its own economic interests, the exit from the European Union, Brexit. I woke up the next morning to see a wonderful headline in the New Yorker comic section, the Andy Borowitz comic sketch section, which was Britain's lose long-cherished right to look down on Americans as dumber than they are. And I suspect, given the polls, that right is something we're going to have lost for quite a long time. Populism has been on the rise, left-wing populism and right-wing populism, really almost continuously across Western democracies since 2008, since the Great Recession, the Wall Street meltdown, and of course the subprime mortgage crisis. Interestingly, in many countries where you would expect the left would have benefited more from this backlash against establishment elites, in fact, the right has benefited more. In Europe in particular, if you look at what's happened to the center-left parties, they have continuously dropped since 2008. They've lost power, but even in opposition, their share has shrunk. But you've seen far-left populism growing in its place, and you've also seen far-right populism growing in its place. And if you look at a map of American or European politics from 20 years ago, in Europe, the center-right and the center-left parties would get between 80 or 90% of the vote between them. And they would toggle and share power in coalitions or swap power, but essentially the center ground was overwhelmingly predominant. Nowadays, that share of the middle parties, the center-left, center-right, has gone down to 60%, in some cases 50%, some cases dropping below 50%. If you look at a breakdown, and The Economist did a wonderful pie chart of this, of America's voting preferences, and you split American primary preferences into different parties. Namely, there's a Hillary party, there's a Jeb Bush party, there's a Donald Trump party, and there's a Bernie Sanders party. The Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump combined preference of the American electorate's about half of American voters. It's about half. And I think that's an extraordinary measure of the degree to which trust in politics is normal, trust in Washington being able to govern in a pragmatic way on behalf of the electors, the people of America, has reached an all-time low and continues to crater. So what does that mean in the immediate future? Well, I think the question now isn't whether Hillary is going to win, but by how much. And therefore, the most immediate question that follows that is, will Donald Trump go out with a bang or with a whimper? Now, we're already seeing, as I said, Utah is in play. For the first time, I think, since 1964, there is a possibility that in a presidential election, Utah will not vote for the Republican nominee. There's maybe a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 possibility that that will be the case. Texas is in play, according to some of the polls over the weekends. Georgia is in play. Arizona is in play. So it looks like Donald Trump will be facing quite a heavy electoral college defeat. How will he respond to that? Well, I think the chances that he's going to contest this election, that he's going to claim it was rigged, that he's going to try and spark some kind of a crisis out of this, are reasonably high. If you look at Donald Trump's record throughout his business career, he never accepts loss without suing. So if he accepted defeat in this election without seeking legally to hold others to account, that would be a first for Donald Trump. I think it's safe to say that a candidate whose victory is willed by Vladimir Putin, Julian Assange, and David Duke is not a man who's particularly interested in the stability of democracy, or indeed in its reputation for integrity. So I think we can assume, although I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, that he's going to contest the results of this election, and that somewhere between 1/3 to 40% of the American electorate will believe him. The question then arises, what do the big Republican elected leaders do about this? Now, as I mentioned, we've seen many Republicans from this part of the world already reject Donald Trump on character grounds. But others have endorsed, unendorsed, prevaricated, basically fled the microphones and tried not to answer the question. On November the 9th, in that situation, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and others will be unable to ignore the question. They will have to answer the question, do you agree with Donald Trump that this election was rigged? And they will have to say no, unless something very, very odd happens and Cook County sort of takes over all the swing states. I think they will have to say no, at which point they will be taking a huge risk of painting themselves exactly how Trump has depicted them, Breitbart News and others have depicted them, as the establishment stabbing Trump in the back, as the establishment stabbing the true blue-collar white electorate in the back. And that will produce, I have very little doubt, an intensification of the Republican Civil War. There is going to be a battle for control of the Republican Party, which is going to make Paul Ryan's job of leading what I think will be a much reduced majority, but I think he'll still have the House. It's going to make his job much, much more difficult. The Freedom Caucus, the more rejectionist side of the GOP, is going to have a larger share of the Republican caucus. If they lose 10, 15, 20 seats, those are going to be the more moderate, pragmatic Republicans. So Ryan's job of keeping his troops in line is going to get more difficult. What does this mean for Hillary Clinton? How do you govern in an age of populism? Now, she's going to be tempted, and many of my colleagues in the media, and particularly in what's known as the liberal media, are going to be tempted to see her victory as an overwhelming positive mandate for her vision of governing America. That's going to be, and as also a sort of demographic predictor of the future. Those people who voted for Trump, they're lost. They've been rejected. And I think if Hillary Clinton takes that signal and immediately governs or starts to deal with the transition period in that somewhat triumphalist manner, that will be a bad augury, because it should not be forgotten that she will, if she is indeed elected, be the first president in the history of polling since Gallup was set up in the 1930s, the first ever president to be elected on a negative trust rating. This will not be an overwhelming mandate for her. This will be a referendum on Donald Trump, and Donald Trump will lose it, I think. So two tests, I think, of how Hillary is going to govern. One is, does she uphold the nomination of Merrick Garland, the centrist judge whom President Obama nominated a year ago, whose nomination has been held up by the gridlock? Or will she listen to the more liberal voices in her party who say, look, we have an opportunity to remake the Supreme Court for the next generation. A couple more retirements are going to happen, most likely in your first term. We need liberal voices. We need Roe v. Wade eternally underwritten. We need Citizens United overturned. We need the Heller Second Amendment ruling overturned, and many other liberal priorities. If she does choose to listen to the voices on the left, I think that will be one sign that she's choosing to govern in a partisan way. Another, and I think this is what the world will be watching very closely in a way that isn't normally true, is who's she going to appoint as her trade representative? Who is going to be the USTR? Because if there's one litmus test the rest of the world, and particularly America's allies in Asia, have as to whether America is going to come back onto the global stage, as to whether it's going to reassert its leadership, it's whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be passed. So let me give you a glass half full. I appreciate I'm probably sounding a little bit pessimistic. Let me give you a glass half full scenario of how things can go right and how the stimulative juices of business investment can actually benefit from this very precarious division of government we're going to be seeing, likely to be seeing after November the 9th. The glass half full is that Hillary Clinton and Paul Ryan are both ultimately workhorses, not show horses. They're both ultimately transactional Midwestern types who want to have their names on legislation. And the most likely legislation that we're going to see is, I think, something that involves a repatriation of overseas corporate revenues at far lower rates of tax, linked with a big infrastructure spending bill and a broader corporate tax reform, which involves lowering the corporate headline rate, eliminating loopholes, broadening the base, and simplifying the tax, a great holy grail of economists, simplification. This is the kind of mini-Graham bargain that could provide a demonstration effect that I think would probably be a positive demonstration effect that could probably be out of all proportion to the size of the bill. It could show that Washington still works, even in what I think is going to be an even more acutely polarized Congress than the previous one, more liberals, more conservatives. That's the glass half full, and I'm not ruling that out. That is possible. The glass half empty is, if you remember the third debate last week, Hillary Clinton made two very specific, unprompted promises in that debate, which are that much more significant, so close to an election she's likely to win. Very, very clear hostages to fortune. The first of which was she promised to embark on comprehensive immigration reform within her first 100 days. Now, imagine the picture. You've got Paul Ryan dealing with a very large section of Trumpian supporters and of Freedom Caucus people who believe that this election has been rigged, or at least arranged by the establishment and by the mainstream media. An election that was bitterly fought, in particular, over the question of illegal immigration and of building the wall with Mexico. If Hillary Clinton delivers on that unprompted pledge to embark on immigration reform, something that on policy grounds I'm sure we'll all agree is perfectly sensible, get high-skilled workers, have a path to citizenship for those who follow the law and pay back taxes, etc. You all know the drill of this very, very familiar piece of legislation. Something that on policy grounds is perfectly sensible is, in this context, on political grounds, absolute dynamite. And I believe that if Ryan hasn't been challenged for the speakership during the lame duck period, and Ryan did agree at some level to cooperate with an immigration reform bill, he would be challenged by then. So that's the glass half empty. Politics gets even worse, and the kind of polarization that we saw in the first part of Obama's presidency would look like a dress rehearsal, a moderate dress rehearsal compared to this. And that's the glass half empty. What about America's leadership on the global stage? Now, I think this is of huge importance that you might, even though you are a very, very successful, value-added, export boom state here in Utah, and as a landlocked state, that's a particularly impressive accomplishment. Even though you understand the benefits of day-to-day in your business of access to high-growing Asia-Pacific markets, I think that large parts of America do not. The reputation the United States has around the world, and in particular, and Western democracy in general, has taken a severe battering. And I think you're probably aware of what foreigners think and of how closely they're watching this, how attentive people have been to this election, more so even than the 2008 election. This election has captured global imagination like no other. And I think you're probably also aware that what we saw in the 1990s and even in the early '80s, which is the increasing democratization around the world of former autocracies embracing forms of democracy, has stopped and to some extent gone into reverse in the last few years. That democracy is very much on the defensive worldwide, and democracy is a model to be watched, to be admired, to be emulated, and American democracy in particular as a model to be admired and emulated is very much in question at this time. So the idea that we agree things, that we debate things on the basis of disagreement, but common ground as to what facts mean. Your former senator, well, not yours, but the former senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, once famously said, look, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That sort of shared a sense that we might disagree with each other, but we have a sort of common rules of evidence and of debating and disagreeing. That's in question. There's a very famous, in Russia at least, Russian journalist, not known for its objective journalism, to put it mildly, who wrote a book recently called Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. And I think we've seen the degree to which the nothing is true, everything is possible politics has entered our discourse in the West. The kinds of stories on the far left and the far right that are believed without evidence is something new. Is something new to our politics. The level of incivility, the degradation of courtesy, all of these facets are things that are being noticed and picked up very acutely by the rest of the world. The second sort of challenge for America reasserting its leadership in the world, in addition to showing its model can work, can still work, is to pursue the policies that have underwritten our prosperity since the Second World War, since American leadership began, namely to uphold Pax Americana, to lead with allies, to multiply American power through alliances, to uphold and negotiate and ratify and implement international trade agreements, to do so on a relatively bipartisan basis, where there is basically an agreement that American leadership is a good thing, and that American openness and American-led globalization serves America's interests, and that's in question. So the other specific that Hillary Clinton offered in the third debate, again unprompted, which is why I think it was significant, was to say that TPP would be dead under her administration. Now, I've recently been to Asia. I go there quite a lot. Many of my colleagues do. In fact, in this morning's Financial Times, we have an interview with the Singapore Deputy Prime Minister. The Singapore Prime Minister was here last August. Other parts of Asia, the Japanese, it doesn't matter really who you talk to, the Australians, the Thais, the Japanese, the Philippines until recently, they've been behaving rather oddly. But America's allies all say, look, you negotiated this deal. This deal is of economic significance. It's also of geopolitical significance. That if America cannot ratify and uphold a deal it negotiated, then countries that, neighbor China, that are watching China set up alternative economic deals, alternative economic institutions, they will increasingly start to follow China. So I think TPP is a big touchstone a very big touchstone from the eyes of the rest of the world, particularly the Asia-Pacific region, of whether America is going to renew its leadership, of whether America is back. After an extraordinary election, can America come back? And I have no doubt, having interacted over many years with people around Hillary, and including Hillary herself, that she probably supports TPP quite strongly. That when she said this is the gold standard of trade deals, of course it has flaws, but this is a better trade deal than we've seen negotiated before, that she meant it. But that she judged that politics made it impossible for her to support it. She has now voluntarily made herself gone further than she needs to have gone by ruling out TPP in that debate and during this campaign in a way that leaves very, very little wiggle room. So if it isn't passed in lame duck, and I think Mitch McConnell has signaled that it won't be, then the chances of TPP happening are very, very slim. What are the other challenges she's going to face? Well, the battle for Mosul, the last stand of ISIS, is going to presumably be continuing. Syria will be 2-3 months further down the line. She has heard of Aleppo. She does know where Aleppo is, so that's a good thing. But it's going to be a very, very difficult problem to which she's committed to taking a far more activist and high risk, but perhaps more highly admirable stance than the Obama administration. North Korea is finally getting within range, within ballistic missile range of the American mainland. We're now within, experts say, 18 months to 3 years of the North Korea threat being no longer academic. I think all of us are used to our eyes glazing over when we hear about North Korea, because it's a sort of Potemkin village of nuclear testing. But Kim Jong-un has tested increasingly high-yield nuclear devices, and he's extended the ballistic missile range of Korea's nuclear capability. It's not Iran. Iran actually has different centers of power. Some consensus is needed. North Korea is Kim Jong-un. It's one guy whose sanity we do not know. If ever there were a case for preemptive strikes, it would be on Pyongyang, with a Kim Jong-un having nuclear missile range of the American mainland. So that's something Hillary is going to have to deal with. She will need China's cooperation to fix that problem. She will need Asian goodwill to fix that problem. And so I cannot overstate the importance of TPP, finding some way to get TPP through, to demonstrate America is back. How do you govern in an age of populism? So let me sort of take this back to the beginning, where I started, about character, and the importance of leadership and the importance of courage. I believe that, as I said, Hillary Clinton and Paul Ryan are both characters who wish to get stuff done. I don't think they want to simply pose on the stage and sign nothing and have nothing to their name. But in order to fulfill those ambitions, they're both going to have to show the kind of spine that has been lacking in American and Western politics in general in the last few years. They're going to have to reach in deep to the founding father principles of the character of leadership, of going beyond your particular faction in order to indulge that very American virtue, that an American word, in fact, pragmatism, is to risk the enmity of their own parties in order to get deals done. All the stuff that we know needs to be done, whether it's tax reform that will help stimulate investment, whether it's better infrastructure investment, whether it's a sort of Marshall Plan, which I believe is needed for America's middle-skilled, middle class, a training program that's going to upgrade this labor force and help it compete. This is all going to depend on these two characters, I think, more than anybody else, Hillary Clinton and Paul Ryan, facing down their own parties, taking risks, making enemies amongst their own partisan ranks to get stuff done. So I believe ultimately the way you govern in the age of populism is by character. And I could think of no better place to make that point than here in Utah. Thank you very much for tolerating me. If you have questions, I think we have time for some questions, so or comments, or vehement disagreements with anything that I've said. I'd be delighted to take them. I think there are mics on either side of the hall. So if anybody wants to make a point or ask a question, please stick your hand up. There's a gentleman in the middle row here.
Thank you. Do you see any wiggle room whatsoever for Hillary Clinton to tweak TPP sufficiently so that she can save face with the ultra-liberals and still adhere to hopefully her core principles of supporting an important agreement like this?
I hope so. I mean, I think, though, that if you look at, I was in Philadelphia for the convention there, and the first day, as you know, had these no TPP signs, the Bernie Sanders people. In order to make that a relatively successful convention, in order to buy off the left of the party, the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, she had to go much, much further than she would have liked to have gone. I don't think she's going to risk political capital in the first few months trying to get a trade deal through the back door in an elitist way. And you can imagine all the language that would come from it after having won an election on this basis and a nomination on this basis. But Japanese and the others, the Japanese are the most important partner, I think are very willing to do nominal side deals that will help make it presentationally easier for a Clinton administration or any administration to get it through Congress. I don't think the problem lies in Asia. There is strong demand for this deal. The problem lies, in this case, on the left of the Democratic Party. And I guess the question would be, what does she give them to buy that support, if indeed she chooses to go for TPP, which I doubt. I'm not sounding very optimistic, am I? Sorry, the gentleman there in the fourth row.
You began by suggesting that it would be international trade, successful international trade, that would actually promote peace. Is there enough of a groundswell in a group like this, or how much more would it take amongst those who are trading internationally on an individual company basis to counteract the degeneration in the political era?
That's a very good question. It's one of the key questions, in fact. Look, I'd say the really interesting thing about, if you look at American opinion polls, majority of people support TPP. Majority of people support comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, I know these questions can be skewed, but across a range, Pew, Gallup, it's the intensity of the minority who oppose it that's at issue here. It's their level of anger. Those who support lukewarmly. Those who oppose in a hot way. So we're going to have to find better ways of selling these deals. I think that businesses' role in partnering with community colleges, in helping sponsor better federal retraining legislation than we have now, it's really not good quality. There are something like 47 different programs that overlap, don't coordinate. It's a sort of federal mess. To have business play a key role at the state level, the local level, in very visibly getting involved in retraining people who, for technology or trade or whatever reason, are finding that their skills are obsolete. I think that could go a long way towards assuaging that very strong minority that oppose continued American global engagement. So I think business has a very, very strong, more prominent role than we've seen so far to play. And I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's absolutely where it's at. I'm hoping for a question from the governor, but I suspect I'll be asking the governor questions later. Yes, over there.
You mentioned a few of the different challenges the U.S. has with China, North Korea, et cetera. In the post-Brexit world, is Britain more likely to be a partner with the U.S. and perhaps with Western Europe in dealing with some of these challenges that we see in other parts of the world?
There's one way that Britain's enthusiastic renewal of partnership with America can probably be bought, and it might be easier in the politics of trade that I was discussing, which is a UK-US trade deal. Britain had a brilliant situation. It's got very, very little to negotiate away. It's a very open market. There are no tariffs. There's very few barriers to investment, to foreign ownership of key assets. And as a member of the European Union, it basically therefore bargained away access to other countries in order to increase its access to theirs. That was a perfect, optimal position to be in, which unfortunately it's just flushed down the toilet. A US-UK trade deal would help persuade Brexiteers who are now in charge that the United States is still a partner. It would be easier to sell in Washington than a deal that includes Vietnam and other parts of East Asia. But I don't believe that Britain's going to play the role in the near future on a global stage, let alone even on the near sort of Middle Eastern stage that it has played in the recent past. I think Brexit is going to consume all the bandwidth. The negotiation of this divorce is a hugely complex, quite long-term thing. And it's going to consume all the sort of best minds in government, unfortunately. Yes, gentleman next.
Can you give us an update on China-North Korea relations and how trade is affecting that?
Well, the last thing China wants, there's two contradictory things. There's two different things China doesn't want. One is the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and that will bring a powerful US ally up to its borders that has missile defense systems being put in place by the Obama administration. I'm sure Hillary will step that up. But it also doesn't want North Korea to collapse. It doesn't want the wave of refugees that would cross the Yellow River and create all sorts of instability and economic cost in China. It does not want war between the United States and North Korea either. And so Kim Jong-un is a recalcitrant satellite. He does his own thing. China does not want instability. It does not want noise. It wants the status quo on the Korean Peninsula. And the closer he gets to nuclear range of America and its key allies, the more likely a preemptive war of some kind will happen. So China is deeply troubled, from what I understand, by Kim Jong-un, cannot control him, and it's a very dynamic situation. I don't think people have appreciated the degree to which this could blow up very, very early in the next administration. I don't know what China will do. It's not going to support a preemptive war on North Korea, and therefore it will do its best to prevent him from reaching those capabilities, but it hasn't had much luck so far. I'm pretty sure my time is up, isn't it? I don't know what the, is it 9:30? It's 2 minutes, so we have time for one more question, or indeed comment. The lady in the fourth row.
From your sentiments expressed earlier, the rejection of the TPP is really continued polarization of the political parties in the U.S. Do you foresee anything that Clinton and Paul Ryan can do potentially to close that gap economically, or do you think that it will continue to grow?
The solutions to America's middle class crisis, the middle-skilled crisis that we've been seeing, I think are really quite obvious. And I think most people, there isn't that much dispute amongst left-wing or right-wing economists, people not in politics, that you do need a retraining. You do need more modern trade deals. You do need better safety nets and transition assistance for people who are in training to upgrade their skills. And you need it on a large scale, on a scale and with a competence we haven't seen for a long time. This is why I use the term Marshall Plan. I believe if Hillary Clinton can face down the left of her party on corporate tax reform and have a lowering and a broadening, that she might have the leverage there to get a bargain with Paul Ryan that would include quite significant spending levels, perhaps revenue neutral, that would invest in the American middle class. But it is all about the American middle class. And I think when you have a hollowing out of a middle class, you have a hollowing out of the center ground of politics. And so it's also a key explanation as to why politics is so polarized. The economy is too. It's down to Hillary and Ryan. Can they do business? I see no other realistic way of addressing this. Any more questions? Yes.
One more question.
Please.
With regard to the polarization between our political parties in perspective to the geopolitical perception that the rest of the world is looking in, we mentioned TPP. What are the views of the other 5 countries as it relates to the nuclear arms deal, where the rhetoric, as we know, during our elections has been opposed or wanting to renege on that agreement?
I'm sorry, the nuclear arms deal
With Iran.
With Iran. The Iranian arm, look, Hillary strongly supports it, Trump strongly opposes it. As you know, it attracted very few Republican votes in the Senate. And as you know, Netanyahu addressed the joint houses of Congress to oppose this. I think that the role Hillary Clinton played in helping to negotiate this, it was concluded after she left the job as Secretary of State, was a bit more skeptical than the way the negotiations were undertaken by John Kerry after she left that, after he replaced her in that job. I think she's tougher on Iran. I think there is a strong perception that Iran is exploiting quite sort of wide latitude within the deal to develop its ballistic missiles, to continue to sponsor proxies throughout the region. It's playing a role just second only to Russia in supporting the Assad regime. And Hillary's going to, I think, be tougher and more engaged and less passive than President Obama with Iran. Saudi Arabia is the sort of other side of this coin. As you know, the oil, there is a deep and profound fiscal crisis in Saudi Arabia. All the people who are used to high subsidies, the population, and jobs that pay way more than they're worth, are now getting used to a different, very different world. So the prospect for radicalism in what is a very young population in Saudi Arabia is huge, and I think she's going to have to be aware of that. There is something, akin to a Middle Eastern civil war, a sectarian civil war unfolding in territory after territory. How the Iran deal is upheld, whether it's upholdable, and whether Saudi Arabia can be steered in a more responsible direction to really stop exporting radicalism and to try and democratize at home. These are key questions that no US president can directly affect, but that any US president is going to have to cope with. So I suspect once again, we'll be thinking of pivots to Asia, but in the short term, the Middle East, the urgent will be driving out the important. And that's something that Hillary Clinton's going to be dealing with from day one. Right, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate your invitation. It's lovely to be here.